Hi, everyone. Welcome to the January Random Review. I'm Deborah Goldenberg, and Connie Giorgio and I coordinate this program for the Friends of the Library, which sponsors these events. Connie, would you like to say hello to the audience?
Hello, and enjoy the review.
And our library host today is Bonnie Brzezowski, and she'll be fielding the questions at the end of the program. And Bonnie, would you like to greet the audience?
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Glad you're here.
If you're having any problems with the GoToWebinar platform, you can type a question into the question box and we'll try to help you. We're recording this presentation, so if your issues can't be resolved, you'll find a link to the recording in your follow-up letter and you'll still be able to see the talk. Also, there'll be a link to a more polished version on the Random Review page on the library website soon. On that same page, you can sign up to receive monthly Random Review email announcements and also find a link to a list of library books related to today's topic created by our volunteer, Gail Gerdeman. And now you can register for any of the remaining Random Reviews for this year on that same page. We encourage you to submit questions for our speaker during or after the talk by typing them into the question box, and she'll answer as many as we have time for at the end of the program. And a big announcement, after missing last year, the Friends of the Library is planning to hold the big book sale this year at the Benton County Fairgrounds. So save February 25th, 6th, and 7th. More details will be forthcoming next month. I'd like to thank the community sponsors of this program, Grassroots Books and Music, Northwest Graphic Imaging, and the Corvallis Gazette-Times. And as always, a big thank you to the Best Library, and especially librarians Mike Hansen and Bonnie Brzezowski, who have provided indispensable support to us in the presentation of our virtual programs and other things. Next month's review will be on February 9th. We've had a change of reviewer for this event. Barbara Taylor will be discussing the book, The Codebreaker, Jennifer Doudna, Gene Editing and the Future of the Human Race by Walter Isaacson. Now, I'd like to invite David Grube, member of the Random Review Selection Committee and reviewer of multiple books, to introduce today's speaker. Enjoy the review.
Thank you very much, Deborah. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Dee Kirwan as the reviewer today. I've known Dee and her family for many, many, many years, and Dee has a long history of interest in immigrants and their stories. Her family, her father was actually born in England and immigrated to the United States when he was 9, and her mother was born in Russia and immigrated to the United States when she was 10. Dee was raised in Virginia and went to William and Mary College, where she got a degree in sociology. But before that, when she was in the 4th grade, she read some books about the Oregon Trail and prophesied that one day she would take the Oregon Trail, and we're so lucky that she did. She got a postgraduate degree in Eugene in special education. And after she had her children, when they were very little, she jokingly told me that she saw an ad in the paper for Crossroads International, which provided childcare, and it gave her an opportunity to begin the work that she's done so well. She was at Crossroads for a while. She was at Lynn Benton Community College working in languages. And then she was the founder and coordinator of the Corvallis Multicultural Literary Center for many, many years, and still works with them, and has been working with refugees, particularly helping them manage the many difficulties that they face, as we learned about when we read this book. And if that isn't enough, she's also writing her own book for her granddaughter Zelda, and I hope I get a chance to read that when she's finished. So Dee, thank you so much. I'll welcome you to the screen, and I'm really looking forward to your evaluation and interpretation of this excellent book.
Am I on? Let's see. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for the librarians for the help with the technology. If anybody who knows me knows that's not my comfort zone. So anyway, thanks to Deborah and Connie and David and the Random Review Committee for selecting this book and inviting me to share the review. And today we're talking about After the Last Border, Two Families and the Story of Refuge in America by Jessica Goudeau. I hope she won't mind that I'm going to refer to her as Jessica for the sake of this presentation. Before I begin, I want to give a special thanks to We2, Welcoming Immigrants to Oregon, a local group of committed volunteers which has been involved in sponsoring immigrants and refugees to our local community. This group recently welcomed 2 women and 5 men from Afghanistan. They have coordinated efforts to meet their needs in housing, English language instruction, medical care, employment, transportation. Our community is so much richer for their incredible work. Thank you. The selection of this book is certainly timely, and that probably is an understatement, and an important addition to the current conversation of exactly who we are as a nation. For me, the theme is a personal one. As David said, both my parents immigrated to the United States as children. And as a child of immigrants, I never understood completely how crossing borders made them who they were. As a lover of traveler, I've been the outsider in places that taught me as much about my own culture as the one that I was visiting. As a teacher of English to speakers of other languages, I've been a privileged listener to countless stories from my students. This book opens the door for you too, to be a privileged listener. The author tells a personal story using 2 refugee families that she came to know in Austin, Texas over a decade of time. She connects the personal to the history of refugee resettlement in the United States. She pulls us into what she calls a relational journey. There's a quote in the beginning of the book from Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. Where should we go after the last border? Where should birds fly after the last sky? Where should plants sleep after the last breath of air? I'd like to add a quote from Somali poet Marjan Shire. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Almost every day, the news is full of visuals of the current refugee crisis. Small overloaded boats, families walking and walking, carrying bundles of belongings, hundreds of tents, crowds at the borders of many countries. What is beyond these visuals of thousands of moving people? Jessica Goudeau gives us an opening into the personal world of 2 refugee families and the policies that impact their lives. And in the process, challenges some of our assumptions about refugees and immigration. The book is structured in sections that move back and forth. They're the narrative-driven stories of 2 people in the backdrop of political realities. Muna is a Christian from the Karen minority group in Myanmar. She arrives in Austin in 2007 with more than 14,000 Myanmar refugees who were approved for resettlement in the US from refugee camps in Thailand and Malaysia. It's not that all 14,000 went to Austin, but that was a whole group of people that came together. Hasna arrives in 2016, a Muslim woman from Syria fleeing the devastating attacks by the Syrian government on its own citizens. And there is the story of the US refugee resettlement from 1880 to 2018. This immigration history is divided into time periods and interspersed between the women's stories. The names of the women, their family members, and other refugees, even interpreters, are not their real names for their safety and protection. No one in the narrative wanted their real name used. Most of Muna's story in the book centers on her time from her arrival in Austin and the backstory of life in the Thai refugee camp. Hasna's story is mostly her life in Syria and then in Jordan and her first year in the US from July 2016 to 2017. The women come to the same Texas community about 10 years apart during vastly different political times. Muna arrives in Austin in April 2007. She's lived since she was 5 years old in a refugee camp in Thailand on the border of Myanmar. As Karen, she is a minority group, which is essentially a culture without a homeland. She and her family were persecuted by the military and fled Myanmar along with many other targeted minority groups. And I want to this is from the book. In all her journeys, Muna had very little choice. She was 5 when she crossed into Thailand and ended up in the small camp where she lived out most of her childhood. Circumstances dictated most of the journey that led from that small camp to life in My La years later. The only choice she had really had was a yes or no one to accept the UN offer of resettlement in Texas. Choice was not a thing Muna thought about much at all. Her family was chosen to resettle in the US. Arriving at the airport in Austin, she worried that her black rubber slip-on sandals, which everyone wore in the refugee camp, were too dusty and undignified. She'd been told that they would be getting new shoes and sweaters for the trip, which hadn't appeared. She was afraid that the lack of new shoes meant she had missed some important step that everyone else knew that she did not. And again from the book. Numa could read several things in English already, but she could not understand why the large A22 meant you were on a flight to Dubai, and A23 meant you were going to Hong Kong, but A24 meant Los Angeles. It was one of thousands of things Numa could not grasp. Muna's entire life had been spent with people who looked like her. Occasionally, a white UN worker or volunteer came to the camp, but that was it. Everywhere she turned now were people with different eyes, ears, hair, noses, clothes, skin, mouths, purses, hats, hijabs, necklaces, bracelets, wallets, suitcases, books, food, water bottles, headphones, scarves, pillows, sweaters, shoes. Even when her eyes were down to shield her from the onslaught of strange sights, the language assaulted her ears. Snatches in tones she had never heard, musical, guttural, loving, rude. The smells of perfume, food, sweat, air conditioning kept her from breathing in deeply. Now in Austin, standing in her last airport at the top of 2 escalators going down, she wished desperately for one brief moment that they were back in My La camp. She wished she had her new sweater and shoes. Muna approaches many experiences in these first months with the survival skills that had gotten her this far. Everything pushes against what she knows. Her ability to navigate the new systems and language put stresses on her family and marriage. She struggles with the adjustment. She thrives in English class. Her family benefits from the company of other Myanmar refugees. As Muna learns English and ultimately settles into a job with a fair trade company, she sometimes wonders at her past self and her present self. How does she recognize the American version of herself with the girl in the hand-woven skirts? At one point, she was watching the confident American workers, coffees in hand, wondering how she would ever fit in. She didn't like coffee. Months later, she walks into a conference, greets friends, chai latte in hand. Who is she? She begins to realize that she is all of those things. Now, many of you may be calculating, Muslim woman, refugee arriving with her husband and daughter in 2016, hoping for family reunification with the rest of her family to follow. In fact, the Immigration Act of 1965 established refugee resettlement, merit-based acceptance, and family reunification as the pillars of immigration. But then, as Jessica says, immigration debates have always been about American identity. Because of this, policies fluctuate with political winds. Let's take a moment for some definitions. Refugee is a particular category of immigrants. The Refugee Act of 1980 defined a refugee as someone located outside the United States who demonstrates that they were persecuted or fear persecution due to race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a political social group, is not firmly resettled in another country, and is admissible to the United States. Asylum status is like refugee status, except the person is already in the US and seeks admission at the port of entry. These are not illegal immigrants, since crossing an international border for asylum is not illegal, and the case must be heard according to international law. That said, it's very difficult to get asylum status. In 1980, the Refugee Act passed unanimously. As Jessica notes, people then had reasonable conversations about shared values. Now the discussion is so polarized, we can't even ask the basic question, can we make people safe? In all this, the US views itself as defending the defenseless and welcoming the displaced. Currently, the most refugees worldwide come from Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, Somalia, and recently Venezuela. Bangladesh has the highest number of refugees in the world's largest refugee camp because of the ongoing Rohingya crisis in Myanmar. Turkey also has a large refugee population. Forcibly displaced people include those with refugee status, asylum seekers, internally displaced people, people with protective status. The current total is more than 80 million globally. Of that, 25 million are refugees. While refugees had been a separate class for the purposes of admission to the US, Trump erased the distinctions and lumped all immigrants into the same pot of undesirables, conflating refugees with asylum seekers and with special visa holders, etc., and people with protective status. There's plenty of material about the capricious, unjust immigration policies at different times. But you have to go back more than 100 years to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 to find a time when immigration policy cut out a whole group of people, like the Trump administration did with the Muslim ban. However, political calculations around immigration were not new with Trump. The reality is that since the beginning of immigration programs, politics has factored in quotas and allotment of refugee visas. Different administrations set different caps on the number of refugees who are admitted in any given year. The Patriot Act complicated refugee admissions by vetting under the created Department of Homeland Security. And that included the creation of USCIS, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, and ICE. When my mother came, immigration was through the Department of Labor. Oh, she was there in 1929. In 1980, the first year of the formed resettlement plan, 207,000 were granted refugee status in the United States. In recent years, the average was 70 to 80,000. In 2020, it was 12,000. Post 9/11, anti-immigrant sentiments in the US and Europe brought change in political perceptions of refugees. The refugee crisis is framed in the language of disaster: deluge, flood, swarm. Perhaps we need to reframe the conversation. discussion. Hasna didn't want to leave Syria. War came to her home. Her family crossed little by little over the border into Jordan. Unlike Numa, who lived in a refugee camp in Thailand for many years, Hasna was able to rent an apartment in Jordan, and her sons were able to get work there. The only reason she even agreed to register as a refugee in Jordan was so that her daughter could finish her schooling. It was a time of trauma and grief. Stress of living with uncertainty, upending of family dynamics, bombings, disappearances, children separated, living on the border of Syria and Jordan. She stayed as long as possible in her home until bombings made it impossible. She didn't want to leave and had always planned to return. Syria was a beloved home, and her life before was satisfying and full of beauty. She lived in a vibrant neighborhood with interconnected houses. Her own home was full of generations of family. As she arrived in the US, she felt acutely the loss of her beautiful surroundings. Again from the book. It was regret, not fatigue, that made Hasna's knees feel as though they were about to buckle. She thought with almost physical pain of the gleaming wooden furniture she had sold off or given away in Jordan in the week that passed between getting the news they were coming to the US and leaving on the plane. All the gold that she had used to garner things for a life back in Syria, their entire savings spent on appliances and furniture that in the end she had to beg her neighbors to take. It had been less than 48 hours since she had held her grandbaby's cheeks to her face, and she had left them for this, a bleak existence in a country whose language she could not speak. One misconception is that all refugees are destitute, starving. The classic comment is that people are coming here for a better life. It actually might not be a better life, but rather a safer one. Hasna had a home full of beautiful things. She loves Syria. Her favorite singer is Fairuz, which I recommend checking out on YouTube. And again from the book. Hasna hated that this war had erased the good things in Syria, that people only knew about her country because of the refugee crisis. She wished she had the words to tell people in English that the word Syria is not one to invoke pity or fear. It tasted like honey on her tongue. After Hasna's house in Syria was looted and before it was bombed, a call came from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees asking if she would like to apply for resettlement. The office stressed that most countries, especially the United States, valued family reunification, which means that there was a great effort to keep families together. That was one reason Hasna finally agreed to leave Jordan and Syria and come to the US to keep the family together. She was assured that the family would be right in line behind her. From the book, the thought of leaving her grandchildren until they could join her in Austin left her breathless with grief. How could she leave not knowing that Layla and Youssef were already on their way? But then how could she stay if by going she could ensure that they would all be together again? She would anchor them. She would go ahead with Jibril and Rana so her children could find their way out of war. It was what any mother would do. Her eyes were so swollen she could barely see out of them as they headed to the airport, the goodbyes gutting her. She gulped back sobs as she took the slip of paper that would bring them all a new life and boarded the airplane that took her away from everything she had ever loved. It was a long process for resettlement, more than 2 years. Every decision that Hasna made was for her family, which is why the timing of her acceptance to the US, where there had been a policy of family reunification, was so devastatingly cruel. Between getting a job and keeping in touch with her family in Jordan and Turkey, Hasna couldn't have enough time to spend learning English. Then, January 2017, Trump instituted a travel ban and lowered the admission numbers. After learning that her daughter and grandchildren would be resettled in Quebec because of the Muslim ban, and with a daughter and son scrambling to find refuge in Greece and then Turkey, Hasna reflected, one government decided her city was worth destroying. Another government decided their lives weren't worth saving, and now her family was shattered. She begged Allah to keep his hands on her loved ones all around the world. Hasna's hope diminished to one thin thread. If they could not be together, inshallah, that they would at least be safe. Both Muna and Hasna found strength out of necessity. Muna, determined, resourceful, good with languages. Hasna was the lioness, trying to keep her family together, protecting them, yet creating gathering places to come together. And according to Jessica, a good cook. In Austin, Jessica was already involved with refugees from Myanmar, including Muna, when she noticed a change in the response to refugees. Jessica had met Muna and her children at a community event, and through her, she got involved with the Myanmar refugees in Austin. She taught English, helped women sell products through an artisan project that they had created. In 2015, the rhetoric around refugees shifted. A rise in anti-refugee feelings. Refugee became synonymous with terrorist. In the past, refugees had had a warm support from public. Since she already had a relationship with some refugee women, she reached out and gathered stories. She wanted to bridge this gap that she saw, to find something to balance the anti-refugee rhetoric, to bring stories to a wider audience. These stories were shaped into the book. In interviews, stories were told over and over to get details. She wrote only what they wanted written. She was very respectful of their need for privacy and to protect their families. It took deep listening to get details and emotions, and this helped create a sense of trust. For Hasna's story, Jessica was aided by a Syrian-American translator. Hasna told stories, Amina translated. Jessica asked questions for hours. She captured details and made it easy for us to visualize things. The translator could give context and content, and from the book. For Hasna's side of the narrative, we used a translator, Amina, a friend of a friend who was from Syria but has lived in the United States for several years. Amina's story is also worthy of a book, but as with most of my Syrian American friends, can never be told because it would put people she loves in danger. Her natural empathy makes her one of the most gifted translators I have ever met. Translation is almost an impossible art. An app can bring words from one language to another, but a translator provides context, cultural equivalence, detailed descriptions. Amina brought Hasna's story to life. I had wondered about this level of detail in the book. How could she know that? All those details. After listening to an interview with her, I understood the process of those hours of questioning. It would be something like I have a cup of tea. Oh, what did the cup look like? Was it new? Was it old? Where did you drink it? Did it have milk? Oh, describe the table. Were you drinking with somebody else? Who was there? What were they wearing? And so you can get the idea. Amina and Syrian friends gave feedback on accuracy, and that's one of the strengths of the book. Jessica wanted to accurately reflect the stories. She had beta readers from the Karen people. Muna had a lot of English, and her children also helped with the English in the stories. Through questioning and the help of interpreters, Jessica feels she was able to get vivid descriptions to make the readers feel on the scene. And that's one thing that people have mentioned when they talk about the book. The afterword in the book outlines some of the processes and experience and caveats that went into the story. The movement of the story back and forth from the stories of the women, each of the women, and then into the refugee resettlement history was a little disconcerting for me. I finally got the rhythm of it, but then truthfully sometimes skipped over the immigration part to continue the women's narrative, and then went back and picked up the background. So the story really reads through. One cannot underestimate the trauma that refugees experience. There's the trauma of the situation that causes them to flee. Sometimes the continuing trauma is the separation of families. The trauma isn't over with placement. And there's a story of Muna when she's walking with her son to the grocery store. She remembered not being much older than him. She had to run through long grass herself. She had been quiet, so the junta would not find them. It was a visceral memory, more body sense than formed thought. She felt goosebumps on her arms despite the humid warmth of the day. Her heart raced. She grabbed her son's hand and ran, the flap of her sandals on the pavement when they left the grass for the parking lot underscoring her fear. She arrived at the grocery store. She was breathless and bewildered. The army was half a world away. The panic left her drained. It took longer than normal to walk home with her arms full of groceries. And there's another reading right after that on the impact of trauma. Trauma can cause rage, sadness, and depression. Complex trauma magnifies these symptoms and includes others: distrust of other people, helplessness or hopelessness, a sense of isolation, intense guilt or shame, a change in your own view of yourself, memory loss, the sense that you're detached from your body or your mind, a desire to hurt yourself or others, alcoholism, suicidal thoughts. Many refugees arrived in the United States only to realize that the peace they sought was just as elusive as it ever was, that they brought the war with them in their minds. Jessica described Muna's trauma as scars and Hasna's as wounds, which reflected the amount of time that they had been refugees and then in the United States. And that continuing fresh trauma for Hasna was difficult when she was recalling her own story. Jessica describes the brutality of the war against the Syrian people, the Syrians fearing their own government. The horrible, mind-gripping fear of people so thoroughly traumatized and with such justified fear of their own government that their collective PTSD seeped into the DNA of their children. Syrians fled and fled and fled. They ran on a massive scale: refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced, all looking for any place safe. Many escaped their government to die at the hands of ISIS or in a boat trying to get to Europe, or of starvation along the road to any place at all. By 2014, 4 million refugees had fled Syria to the neighboring countries, 2 million to Turkey, 1 million to Lebanon, 1 million to Jordan. Those countries closed borders rapidly. Routes that had been available even days or weeks before were suddenly gone. Hasna, like many Syrians, points to moments in those years when she thought the world would finally wake up and help. Jessica includes some different quotes from other writers, and she particularly is interested in refugees and refugee writers. And there's some quotes that I want to read that are from a book called The Displaced: Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives by Viet Thanh Nguyen. She includes part of this quote from the introduction of the book Displaced in the book, and she acknowledges that the story for herself that she seeks to tell is an in the meantime story, with the hope that it honors Muna and Hasna, stories that she tells for them. Nguyen, himself a refugee from Vietnam, writes of refugee writers telling their own stories. We need stories to give voice to a writer's vision, but also possibly speak for the voiceless. This yearning to hear the voiceless is a powerful rhetoric, but also potentially a dangerous one if it prevents us from doing more than listening to a story or reading a book. Just because we've listened to that story or read that book does not mean that anything has changed for the voiceless. True justice is creating a world of social, economic, cultural, and political opportunities that would allow all the voiceless to tell their stories and be heard, rather than be dependent on a writer or representative of some other kind. Without such justice, there will be no end to the waves of the displaced, to the creation of ever more voiceless people, or more accurately, to the ongoing silencing of millions of voices. True justice will be when we no longer need a voice for the voiceless. And one more quote from also about borders and justice from this introduction. We should remember that justice is not the same as law. Many laws say that borders are sacrosanct and that crossing borders without permission is a crime. Unpermitted migrants are thus criminals, and the refugee camp is a kind of prison. But if borders are legal, are they also just? There are narratives that refugees tax economic systems, or the bleak Trumpian description of them bring all sorts of negativity to the country. There are also the opposite narratives, that immigrants can do no wrong, they bring value, diversity, etc. What do the immigrants and refugees have to say for themselves? Jessica explains why she in particular wanted to tell this story. She built relationships with the women. The stories are women-based. There were commonalities across cultures. They all had children, they shared connections, they talked about cooking. She is very aware that she is a non-refugee telling a refugee story. So she kept the focus narrow and controlled because she wasn't a refugee. Jessica also is not a journalist. She has a PhD in literature from the University of Texas. She loves novels, so she wanted to write a story that read like a novel, a page turner. And certainly the novelistic details allow you to enter into the emotional experience of these, especially the women's stories. She's also an academic, so there's a desire for accuracy. She used endnotes in the book to give details so as not to bog down the flow of the story. Jessica encourages us to read refugee stories by refugees. She gives credit to the influence of refugee writers on her own work. One book that Jessica recommends is The Ungrateful Refugee by Dina Nayeri, and I agree. It has an intriguing title. People told Dina, who's a refugee from Iran, "You must be grateful to be here." And she said it was like as though the acceptance of the refugees was conditional on them being grateful that we saved them. She makes a case for rethinking the way we look at refugees. Refugees will assimilate just as surely as time passes. They need friendship, not salvation. They need the dignity of being an essential part of society. What they most urgently need to be useful, to belong to a place. In refugee communities, volunteers often ask each other, what can I do to make it easier for them? What we can offer refugees when we try to offer things they might need is dignity and belonging. As she said, no one wants to transform, and yet no one can avoid it. We alter with every breath. Refugees resign themselves to deep tissue change from the day their feet touch new soil, when the shape and the sound of it is still unimaginable. When people think about refugee stories, they only think of them getting out, getting saved, and then everything is fine. And refugees are not just their search for safety. Someone said that refugees are too often defined by what they need and not who they are. So the reality is there's the life before the rescue, the journey, and the life after. But sometimes people only want to hear the escape part. Dina asks, haven't my American neighbors always been curious about me? Maybe it isn't their fault that all we felt comfortable offering were the dramatic escape stories, that we didn't show them pomegranate stews and photos of duck ponds and rivers and mountain hikes. Maybe if we had to show ourselves, they would have loved what they saw, but we were afraid. We couldn't manage it. All refugee stories are not the same, as we even see from even 2 stories in this book. Some come from well-to-do lives that are in the path of war. Some are professionals on the wrong side of politics or beliefs. Some are impoverished and flee starvation and drought. Refugees are much more than their escape stories. They have the before and after stories also to tell. So, what to do after reading the book? Jessica hopes that the book will provide an opportunity to engage and immerse yourself in a world of people you might not have a chance to have a conversation with. And I think she means this even in a different situation of just having conversation with people that we know and that understand us, but also people who have anti-refugee or anti-immigrant sentiments too. So how to approach advocacy? Jessica's suggestions are make mistakes, which usually happens when making assumptions, and learn from them. Come to conversations wanting to listen and learn. Don't underestimate the power of personal connections to change people's ideas. That's probably why we need to expand our audience then too. In an interview, Jessica said she hoped that her book would inspire real conversations, because how people feel influences public policy. Therefore, there's a need for informed conversations. Helping shape public opinion will help shape policy. It is sometimes easier to see the immediate horror of the displacement of people fleeing their homes. It is less easy to see the continuing scars of trauma that such experiences leave. It is easy to see the movement from upheaval. It is less easy to see the causal forces from governments, lifestyle demands, climate, or national economic hegemony, which may be implicated in that movement. The personal stories of Muna and Hasna are accessible pathways to explore the realities of a world that is seeing unprecedented global migration across national borders. The responsibility for refugees knows no border. Jessica said, I have come to believe that refugee resettlement is a bellwether of our country's moral center. How we respond to the greatest humanitarian crisis of our time reveals our nation's soul. I encourage you to explore deeper into the many resources listed in the back of the book. Many of these have been included in the resource list linked to this presentation. They're amazing first-person accounts, powerful graphic novels, tender children's books. After the Last Border provides experiences beyond our own lives. It asks questions for us to consider. It invites us to get more information, and it possibly moves us to action. The book reinforces the importance of many kinds of border crossings: geographic, political, cultural, emotional, and philosophical. And it is also a reminder to practice being an empathetic listener and an interested questioner. And beyond the book, beyond the individual stories, maybe we need to question what moves people and how we can support movement that is a choice, even a right, and not an act of desperation. I wanted to have tea with Hasna and Muna and find out where their stories had taken them and how their families were doing. They're still crossing borders as they live beyond their escape journey and adjust to where and who they are now. We are a nation of many stories. We also tell ourselves stories about who we are as a country. Refugees cross borders for safety. Can we offer dignity as well? What is asked of us? What happens after the last border? Thank you. So, Bonnie, I don't know if there are questions.
Thanks, Dee. Thanks so much. That was wonderful. I want to invite everyone in the audience to please submit any questions or comments at this time. This would be a great time to hear from you if we haven't already. I do have a few comments I would love to share with you, Dee. Carol says, thanks to Dee for the idea of skipping the immigration information to stay with the narrative of the two women and then go back to read it. She says the lack of continuity of the book was why I took it back to the library. Now I'll give it another try.
Good for you. Me too. Me too.
Great advice there.
I wanted to throw one thing in before, just make sure I have enough time for it, because it's a kind of a community thing. One of the things that is helpful is to always support refugees in businesses and economies. And I don't know if people realize that there was in 1998 a refugee from Myanmar created He Shows Sushi franchises, and we have one at Market of Choice. And the day that I went there, just the other day, there's a woman there and her parents. Their parents don't speak English, but I was able to talk to her. So I just wanted people to know that in our community, sometimes there are these invisible people that are also they're creating a life for themselves and in also being part of ours too.
Great, thank you. Nancy just kind of has another comment. She says, this is not a question, but I have found it true. Too often refugees are asked what they need rather than who they are. We need to respect their dignity as much as any other person.
And that's one of the things that I felt was really important to say. And I remember when Corvallis Multicultural Literacy Center was started, it was in sort of response to some of that, where the people that had come to our community were always asked, what do they need? You know, how can we help you? What do you want? And rarely asked, what can you give us? What would you like to share? What can you do to be a part of this community? And I think that's a really important thing to recognize as we engage the immigrants and refugees and everybody within our community too. Thank you.
Thank you. Carol asks, what was the name of the author you mentioned and quoted from near the end who wrote a book about lots of refugees? Do you recall that?
The Ungrateful Refugee, was that the one? There was one called The Ungrateful Refugee by Dina Nayeri, and then the other one was The Displaced, that's edited. And those are also on the list of, I put them on a list of the books too, but they're available at the library too. I'm not sure if the other one is called The Displaced, refugee writers on writing about refugees. I forgot, sorry. Just put my note down.
Great, thank you. And I earlier in the program at the beginning, I did share a link to those suggested books. And so if we were able to include those, they should be on that list that was linked to for the audience.
Yes, I'll just double check that too.
Sure, thank you. We do have another question from Barbara. Have any of the refugees returned to their native homes rather than staying?
Any refugees in general, or I wonder these particular refugees?
Probably the ones in the book is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, not that I know of. The book was written, I think 2018 or something. But anyway, yeah, not that I know of. Usually for a refugee to return, because the situation in which they're leaving is so dramatic, that it's not always possible to go back. I do know that there are people that wait until they have U.S. citizenship and then travel back to home places, but I'm not sure if, depending on what their particular, if they're refugee or asylum status, whether they also go. That would be something that'd be interesting to find out.
For sure, interesting. Marianne asks, can Dee share a story or more of refugees she has met and helped at CMLC?
Marianne, I know. There you are. Yeah, and it was interesting that for me, I realized way too late that I never captured some of these stories too. But they're the things that I think about are the amazing strength and perseverance of the people that I met. There was one woman that was a woman from Laos that was in my class that literally swam the Mekong River with bullets over her head, you know, escaping and living in a camp, and then coming here and just having to start everything from scratch. And then the kinds of, you know, talking about also people that we don't often think about were also very educated people. I had a couple of Vietnamese doctor and his wife was a nurse, and they couldn't practice because the lack of language skills and also the access to certification. There seems, it's almost criminal because we have need for the skills that these people can bring, but they're blocked by that. And it was a source of great depression for them too, because they, again, had those skills and weren't able to practice it. There was an amazing story of a Chinese woman that during the Cultural Revolution escaped from the farm that she was working. She teamed up with her boyfriend who was working on a different farm. They made this very elaborate plan with a bicycle and things stuffed in the frame of the bicycle, and they escaped on Sunday when it was the day of rest, and joined up and literally had to swim the last part of their trip. And she had in her hand a paper with a name, who was a man who was owned a Chinese restaurant in Lebanon, Oregon. And that was her link, and that took her to find this place. And she lived in Albany for years. I've lost some touch with her, so I hope she's still there. But amazing story about, you know, just those connections, and why do people end up in one place and not another too. So that was pretty amazing. And then there were Vietnamese people who were so-called Vietnamese boat people that had lived in the Philippines, and then they came. Now, those are more of the people that I worked with when I was teaching language, the ones that came to the Multicultural Center. It was wonderful to meet them and to ask them again, to have them share their stories and the things that they knew, and to be involved in a community. And I was just telling someone the other day, there was a Mongolian woman who came, and her son was in high school, and he started wrestling, and he was very good at it. And he came by the Multicultural Center one day and showed me the medal that he had won. And I realized that we also have to be there to celebrate when there are things that people have. And he knew that he could come there and somebody knew him, and he could share this special thing that had happened to him too. So being that a safe place for a community where you can share the things that you are, and is amazing.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Wendy asked an interesting question. How does a city like Corvallis become a destination for refugees? Are they invited by a local group, sent by a government agency? What might you know about that?
So it's a little bit about that. Some of the particular categories require a sponsor. So when the Iraq War started, this local group, there was welcoming Iraqis to Oregon. We too, and then we had to become welcoming immigrants to Oregon because things expanded. But then they work in connection with some statewide and national refugee organizations. So I know that one of them is in Portland, SOAR, and so that's a connection for the local organizations, and then they are able to, that's their connection for getting the placements and resources and other information too. So yeah, that's how a lot of people come. One woman that I met at the Multicultural Center was from Sudan, and the way that she came was that she had met a woman from Corvallis at a refugee camp in Egypt when she was there, and when she wanted to come to the U.S., that person from Corvallis sponsored her, so as an individual. So that as long as people have a sponsor, then sometimes they can come.
Great. Thanks. Are there any other questions that people would like to submit? I think we got through most of them. There were a few comments just thanking you, thanking the author, thanking the library, thanking the friends.
Good.
So thank you.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say, oh, sorry.
Please.
And I just want
No,
to
go
say
ahead.
one final thing. This is not my medium. I would much rather be having a cup of tea with it. And I think that this particular story deserves a kind of extended conversation. So I'm hoping maybe we can all gather when the world opens up again and talk about this and figure out what we as individuals can do. How can we influence policies? That I think that's one thing that Jessica kept underscoring, is that policies change because of public opinion, and there's so much misinformation, disinformation. I think that how can we be able to sort of forward the importance of providing safety and opening community to people that need that.
Yeah, definitely. And we do have time for a few more questions, and we did get one, which I think might be interesting to look at. Nancy asked, has the current administration been able to enact any changes in terms of how we
I've been trying to figure out that too as well. There's some of the things I think that they're working on. It's like turning an ocean liner. I mean, it's not a canoe. It's the immigration issues are so huge and so deep, and I think that they're trying some of the things. There's some things that, they've at least been trying to undo some of the things that they can't. And I think that there's so much that's going to depend on how we look at the reasons behind the movements of people and how we can accommodate those that we can and figure out how we can be involved in other ways for those that we can't. So I'm not sure. I try to keep up with it, but I'm not sure that all of the things that have been put in place that were negative have been able to be undone. But also it's a huge issue that is not going to be easily addressed. And I think the more we educate ourselves about it, and the more, I think at least I've had more sympathy for. The look is really bad, but I also know the realities of trying to take care of hundreds of thousands of people, scared people, and just trying to address the needs and also provide safety is huge. Yeah, it's beyond what I can even imagine.
Yeah. Kristen just provided an interesting comment. The Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Corvallis has helped a family come here from Burundi and another one from El Salvador. So that's interesting. Good to know.
And that's great. That's so helpful.
Yeah. And then we are just here at 12:59. I just want to say one little thing, just that you're many times during your presentation, I was reminded of this quote from Mr. Rogers, and it's, there isn't anyone you couldn't learn to love once you've heard their story. It's actually a quote I have above my desk, and just sort of a reminder that, like, it's easy to just be intolerant of someone, but if you take a second to listen to a little bit about who they are, it really changes everything frequently.
I have a version of that says you can't hate people whose stories you know. And so that's that same kind of idea. So having those stories out, reading those stories, and is, yeah. And also presenting them, and we all have families. I mean, well, maybe not everybody has family on mine that have no notion of what's involved and have very negative attitudes toward immigrants, oddly, since my family's are immigrants, but I think that is a place to start also. I'm guilty of shying away from that myself, but I think that finding places where the conversation will actually, maybe, like you say, change the, offer the story and change the idea.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I would like to invite Deborah, Connie, and David to just pop back on so we can give you all a proper farewell.
Here we are. I'd like to say thank you to Dee for such a heartfelt presentation. It was truly wonderful. And thank you to all of you for joining us at Random Review today. We hope to see you again next month. And have a good month, everyone. Bye.
Bye,
Hi, thanks for
everybody.
being here.
Thank you.